Good morning, and welcome to AEI's Election Watch program, the longest-running political analysis program in Washington. In 53 days and 11 hours, Election Day voting begins. In 2008, a third of voters cast their ballots early or absentee. We expect that could be as high or higher than 40% this year. North Carolina was first on this year's early and absentee voting calendar, and voters there started casting their ballots on September 6th. Voters in Kentucky and Indiana will start voting on September 17th, and Wisconsinites on September 20th. This morning, we're going to try to give you a sense of how close this election really is by first looking at swing states. Michael Barone will walk us through those. Then we'll turn to Henry Olson, who's running a little late, who will talk about the Senate contest. Jennifer Marsico has prepared the handout that you all have on the Senate contest, which tells you what Washington's top political prognosticators, in addition to those on the panel, Charlie Cook, Stu Rothenberg, and Larry Sabato. It tells us where they see the contest at this point. Then I'll turn to Norm. I'd like to say a word or two about the new issue of Political Report, which I couldn't put together without our very able assistant, Andrew Rugg. It's our monthly guide to things that we're watching most closely. The first page is a summary of where the race stands, and then we look at the public's predictions about who will win. The public actually has a pretty good track record of predicting who will win, and at least at this point, Obama leads by a very substantial margin. Then we look at the debates, whether or not they move the needle in campaigns. At Gallup's historical analysis, which suggests that they do not, except in a few unusual circumstances. And then we'll be looking in this issue at a few issues that we've been hearing a lot about, Medicare and particularly abortion. September 17th will mark the first anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, and the polls show that movement hasn't gained much traction and that the income gap still trails other issues in importance. ABC News and the Washington Post asked some interesting questions in their new poll. My favorite one asked who you would rather have as the captain of your ship in a storm. 46% of registered voters said Romney, and 43% said Obama. Again, a very close race. My task this morning, though, is to say a few words about the mood. And for those of you who've been attending these Election Watch sessions, you know that I've sounded like a broken record at the earlier sessions, saying that nothing seems to matter but the economy. But as I've said many times before, foreign policy is always there as a concern. The economy has been on the front burner at a full boil since the fall of 2008, but foreign policy has been there at a steady simmer, and every once in a while it comes to a boil. President Obama gets very good marks on handling foreign policy, among the best of his presidency. Americans applauded the decision to pull our troops out of Iraq and to draw them down in Afghanistan. The partisan divisions that we highlight in Political Report on the role of government now extend to views about America's role in the world. Politics no longer stops at the water's edge. John Zogby recently reported on the results of a question about American exceptionalism. He asked people to agree with two different statements. The first statement is, the United States is the world's indispensable nation. American values are what most people in the world want, and the U.S. acts legitimately as the world's true superpower. The second statement read this way: the United States has reached its limits as a superpower and needs to coordinate foreign policy and protect its interests more in concert with other major powers like China, Russia, Brazil, and India, as well as with allies and groups like the United Nations and NATO. Coordination and cooperation are always popular, so the leading from behind alternative edged out American exceptionalism view very narrowly. But what impressed me about the question were the partisan divisions. Democrats and Republicans were mirror images of one another. 53% of Democrats sided with the second statement, which might be called leading from behind, and 55% of Republicans with the first one, the indispensable nation formulation. Although Americans are reluctant internationalists, they recognize that this is a very dangerous world and that U.S. leadership is key. They want a defense that's second to none, although they believe that the defense budget and every other government department can be cut. They worry about China's economic and military strength and, as always, have their eye on the very volatile Middle East. AEI's Vice President for Foreign Policy, Danny Pletka, emailed me yesterday afternoon saying the focus on foreign policy is good news for Romney, or at least it should be. Foreign policy, she says, is a huge vulnerability for the president, and it could be an area in which Romney shines. She's been critical of both camps on these issues, and she goes on to say the American people are focused on the disaster of the economy, but as we learned this week, there's disaster waiting around every corner abroad as well. We're vulnerable everywhere, not just in Libya and Egypt. Our enemies think we're in full-scale retreat, and they are eager to follow us home. Obama has proven that he doesn't have a vision. Romney has been focused on the economy. If he can articulate a vision, she says, where we have none, he'd be doing himself and the nation a service. To touch on a couple of other hot topics, the last poll on teacher strikes was conducted in 2010 by the Associated Press. 51 said teachers should be able to strike, and 45% said that they should not. I don't have any poll data on Robert Griffin III, but I expect I know what it would say. The Washington Post, however, did conduct a poll recently, and they shared some of the partisan breaks with me about sports. And they found, again, we have a lot of partisan divisions, but here's where we didn't have one. Democrats and Republicans were equally likely to prefer football over baseball. Republicans were more likely to be big football fans, while Democrats were more likely than Republicans to have played football in high school. In a memo to interested parties on Monday, Romney pollster Neil Newhouse began by saying, "Don't get too worked up about the latest polling." He argued correctly that convention bounces are like sugar highs. We've had only a few polls, only a handful of polls since the Democrats' convention, and Obama clearly got a bounce from it. What remains to be seen is whether it will last. In the new Fox News poll released this morning, it was conducted September 9 through 11, 48% of likely voters said they would vote for Obama and Biden, and 43% for Romney and Ryan. That's the most recent poll we have. Before the convention, Romney had a 10-point advantage among independents. In the new poll, Obama has a 5 percentage point advantage. 17% of that very crucial group are still undecided. The president's good convention did not change his approval-disapproval numbers. His approval rating in most polls hovers around 50%. Mitt Romney's not quite as good convention did little to warm the public up to him. In some polls, Romney has the edge on handling the economy. In the new Fox News poll, they're tied. Obama has the edge on handling foreign policy and also on handling terrorism. Although Obama does much better than Romney on handling women's issues, there is no indication that these issues will move significant numbers of female voters this fall. The Democratic salvos on women's reproductive rights and abortion are designed to get some key groups to turn out on Election Day who didn't turn out in significant numbers in 2010. One important group for the Democrats is single women. Obama leads Romney by 38 percentage points, among them in the new Fox poll this morning, and the other is women with a postgraduate degree who lean about 70% Democratic. Several recent polls show that the Democrats expanding their margin as the party that people want to control Congress. That's a fairly new development. Republicans throughout this campaign have been winning the enthusiasm contest, but the new polls make it clear that the Democrats are catching up. This summer, we had an event on the millennials, one of the groups that did not turn out in significant numbers in 2010. Andrew Rugg and Jennifer Marsigo assembled a very, very impressive panel to talk about the millennials who are still leaning very, very strongly to the president. The real question, of course, about millennials and Latinos is whether they'll turn out on Election Day. 46% of likely voters in the new Fox poll say the country is better off than it was 4 years ago, but 49% say that it isn't. When asked about their own personal situations, 42% said that they were better off, while 42% said that they weren't. 80% still believe the country's in a recession. 49% say that Romney does not have a clear plan to improve the economy. 51% give that response about Obama. So that's a quick sketch of where we are in terms of the mood, and now I'll turn to Michael to talk about some of those important swing states, and we have a slide that we'll put up as he speaks about them. Michael.
Well, thank you, Carlin. As you said, this continues to be a close race. The national polls show, on average, a small lead for Obama. This morning's number, we rounded off at Real Clear Politics at 48% to 45%. We've really seen the candidates running in a range of between 43 and 49% pretty consistently throughout the cycle, I think, in that close range. We put up a map here of arguable target states. And, many people have compared this campaign cycle with the 2004, the race between George W. Bush and John Kerry, which was a long, hard slog through about a dozen clearly established target states. But I think there are some differences. 2004 came near the end of a period of unusually stable partisan voting behavior. If you look at the 4 preceding House elections, and the popular vote for the House since the mid-'90s has been a pretty good proxy of support for the president and his party. If you look at the 4 preceding House elections before 2004, the Republican and Democratic percentages of the popular vote ran within a narrow 3% band. There was very little variation. And the 2004 results for president and popular vote for the House, in fact, turned out to be within that same narrow band. You had only 3 states change parties between the 2000 and 2004 presidential elections. So it was a period of unusual stability. If we go back in time, it resembles the 1880s, and unfortunately, we don't have anyone in Washington who remembers the 1880s anymore now that Strom Thurmond is gone. But clear memories of the 1880s, a little hazy about the 1980s. We're in a different kind of period now. In the 4 most recent House elections before 2012, the Republican and Democratic percentages of the popular vote have oscillated inside a band of 9%. That's historically a wide band of popular support. And the list of target states has actually changed during the course of the year. Wisconsin and perhaps Michigan, not close states in 2008, are either on the list now or maybe arguably are. Indiana, an Obama state in 2008, is off the list, and so is Missouri, which he narrowly failed to carry, only by 1%. Some of the states now on our list, New Mexico, Michigan, North Carolina, may well fall off in the course of the fall. The Obama campaign was talking about adding Arizona as a target state. That didn't quite happen. But perhaps it will. Previous elections show the potential of these states to go in different directions. Obama carried all 12 of these states in 2008. But in 2010 House elections, Republicans carried the popular vote in 11 of those states, all of them except New Mexico, and it was a close race there. In 2008, overall, Obama carried 28 states plus D.C. and the 2nd District of Nebraska, which currently have 359 electoral votes. In 2010, Republicans carried the House popular vote in 35 states with 351 electoral votes. So there's fields of play for both parties in the map that we see now. I'm going to try and separate out these 12 states in different categories depending on how closely current polling resembles the 2008 election results. In the 3 largest states, Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, current polling looks a lot like 2008. Florida and Ohio were very close in 2008. They were Obama's closest states except for Indiana and North Carolina. He won Florida by 3 points. He's up 2 in recent polling. He won Ohio by 4 points. Is currently up 3 in recent polling. Pennsylvania, he won by 10 points. He's currently up by 8. So I think Romney seems to be competitive for 47 of these electoral votes, 29 in Florida, 18 in Ohio. Not so much for Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes. Then we've got 2 states on this list with large Latino or minority populations, New Mexico with 5 electoral votes and Nevada with 6 electoral votes. Romney's down 10 points in current polling in New Mexico, which some might argue doesn't belong on this list. But he's down only 3 points in Nevada, and I guess that's why we saw Obama head to Nevada yesterday after the first murder of a U.S. ambassador in 33 years. Nevada in 2008, voting population there 10% black, 15% Latino, 3% Asian, according to the exit poll. This is, and similar numbers actually in 2010 when the casinos and the casino unions rallied the minorities to re-elect Harry Reid. Nonetheless, Nevada, which looked out of reach for Romney, I think, in earlier months, now looks like it's seriously contested. I'd group three other states, largish states with a significant percentage of black voters in a third category, and that includes North Carolina with 15 electoral votes, Virginia with 13 electoral votes, and Michigan with 16 electoral votes. I'm from Michigan originally. I remember when Michigan had a lot more electoral votes, had about twice as many electoral votes as North Carolina or Virginia. Now they're edging toward the same, which is an interesting demographic trend. Obama is down from 2008 in current polling by significant amounts in those three states. North Carolina leans towards Romney. Virginia, which was at the national average last time, is evenly divided. I think the latest polling is Romney +1. Michigan, depending on how you evaluate some recent polls, seems to still have a significant lead with Obama, particularly talking about the one domestic issue the Democratic convention talked about a lot, aside from the cultural issues, the one economic issue, the GM and Chrysler bailout. That seems to be more hitting. The reports this morning of the Romney campaign, Republicans are pulling their advertising out of Michigan. There's also been reports that the Obama campaign has been downplaying its advertising in North Carolina. I think there have been no reports that either campaign is abandoning Virginia. And if you see one campaign doing it, that's going to be the campaign that's losing the election. Finally, there are 4 target states with heavily white electorates. Colorado, with 9 electoral votes, does have 12 or 13% of Latino electorate, but you look at the exit polls, they seem less Democratic than Latinos nationally. And these are states that Obama carried white voters. Colorado, 9 electoral votes. Iowa, 6 electoral votes, which Obama has been visiting almost compulsively. They're buying Rochester, Minnesota TV to get Mason City and Cerro Gordo County, Iowa, on their radar there. New Hampshire with 4 electoral votes, and something of a surprise if compared to the beginning of the year, Wisconsin with 10 electoral votes. Electorates here are 1 to 5% black. That's, there's limited amount of that the Obama campaign can do to spur black turnout, absent bringing in some school buses full of people from Chicago to Milwaukee, where you have election day registration. That's the. In any case, it's interesting that those states are in play. You would not predict that Obama carried each of them by at least 10 points in 2010. He seems to be weaker there now in each of those states. In conclusion, every so often we get a series of analyses that say that Romney has a very narrow window in the Electoral College. He needs to carry such and such a state, and if he doesn't, it's all over for him. Of course, that's true if he continues to be 3% behind nationally. He's going to have a very hard time winning in the Electoral College. But I see more flux here among and within the states than we saw in 2004. I see less straight-line relationships with how a state performed in one election to the next, and more fluttering around with patterns that I don't feel that I fully understand here. And one has to keep in mind the inexactitude of polls when you're talking about this as well. And basically, I think their current numbers, to me, point up to multiple paths to 270 electoral vote majority for both the Obama campaign and the Romney campaign.
Thank you. Michael, you're under your 7 minutes, so I'm going to ask a question. Tell us about third-party candidacies in Virginia, Virgil Goode, and then if you could say a word about Gary Johnson and his influence in perhaps both Colorado and New Mexico. I think Colorado has a marijuana initiative on the ballot that could be bring out some voters who might take votes away from Obama. What are your thoughts on those three states in particular and third-party candidates?
Yeah, we've got Virgil Goode, the former Democratic turned independent turned Republican congressman who lost a 2008 race, and I think blames Republican redistrictors for giving him Charlottesville and the university community there, where he lost, obviously, in the 2008 climate. You know, it's hard to gauge the performance of third-party minor candidates in polls because either you omit them from the poll, and then almost nobody volunteers that they're going to vote for this person, even though 1, 2, or 3% might in a general election. Or by putting them their names on the polls, you give them what amounts to equal prominence with the major party candidates, which is really not indicative of most of the information that the voters get during the course of the campaign cycle. So, you know, I think there's a tendency for these votes to evaporate. And, you know, I would see Virgil Goode as a candidate who might get a significant percentage in some counties, but not even over his whole congressional district as it existed when he represented it, much less statewide. Gary Johnson, former two-term governor of New Mexico, I encountered one of his consultants in Tampa, Roger Stone, who may be known to some of you. Roger is a little bit on the eccentric side. It's been around the politics business since the 70s. I mean, I remember seeing him at the 76.
The S&M business even before that.
Well, Roger, yeah, don't ask Elliot Spitzer about him. Anyway, the Mayflower is right over there, by the way. You know, Roger was handing out Gary Johnson's cigarette rolling papers in Tampa. So I think
he had a lot of clients.
He had a lot of. Well, it was a Republican convention, so I'll just leave that question unanswered. The fact is that you know, will he get a few votes here and there? I think probably. Do those come out of Obama or Romney? Maybe a little more out of Obama. I don't think it rises to the level of Ralph Nader. I mean, Nader was surprised a lot of us in 2000. Remember, going into the cycle, everybody thought Pat Buchanan was going to get more votes than Ralph Nader was going to get, and in fact, it proved to be the opposite. Nader got, 2-point-something%, and Pat got 0.39% nationally. Of course, some of those happen to come in Palm Beach County. Interestingly enough, the Democratic ballot designer may have created some problems for the Democratic Party there. You know, it just seems to me that you know, the Nader thing. There was a left-wing complaint against the Clinton administration, echoed, interestingly, by President Obama in his 2008 campaign, less so this time, considering his Wednesday night convention speaker, that, you know, the Clinton administration was a sellout, a betrayal of liberal principles. I'm overstating their case, but it was one that appealed, it turned out, to some significant quantum of voters and netted 2 to 3 points for Ralph Nader. I don't see that happening in this way this time, rating either the Obama or the Romney constituencies too heavily.
Thank you, Michael. Norm has been like a presidential candidate of late. He's been in 7 states in the last few days, and so he can tell us what's really happening on the ground, and also now that Congress is back, what's happening there.
Thanks, Carl, and I can actually tell you more what's happening in the air than on the ground with all the flights. I did wake up yesterday morning in Salt Lake City. It was 82 and foggy, just like Clint Eastwood. The conventions were very interesting. Actually, my favorite moment in Tampa as Hurricane Isaac was looming came when somebody was interviewing Herman Cain and asked him if he remembered Katrina. And he said, "I never knew her, had nothing to do with her, there's no proof anywhere." Of course, in Tampa, we did have Donald Trump scrap his vaunted appearance at the convention. Nobody ever talks about the good things that hurricanes can bring with them. In Charlotte, actually, I picked up the best campaign button I've seen so far. It was a picture of Jenna Jameson. Jenna Jameson, if you don't know, and Roger Stone does, is probably the most successful porn star in America, and she has endorsed Mitt Romney. She said, "I'm rich, so of course I'm voting for Mitt Romney." So it was a porn stars for Romney, and I thought as I got that button, the porn star vote has abandoned the Democrats. This never would have happened under Bill Clinton. With that, let me just, I want to respond a little bit to Carlin's question about independent candidates. I actually think that if this election ends up being a nail-biter and very close, they could make a significant difference this time. It's a great complication for Romney in Virginia, which is why you see a continuing aggressive effort to try and knock Virgil Goode off the ballot. If he gets 1%, in a close election, that can make a difference. And those votes would come from Romney. On the other hand, I think Gary Johnson complicates matters for Obama in New Mexico because a significant number of those votes would otherwise likely be Obama voters. On the marijuana initiative in Colorado, it reminds me a little bit of the marijuana initiative in California, which is, I predict that on Wednesday morning, November 7th, a large number of people are going to wake up and say, "Oh man, was that yesterday?" So it may not have as big an impact on the votes. I did want to spend a minute or two addressing the events of the last couple of days. With more than 50 days to go, many more things will happen, and one does not want to put too much emphasis on any one thing. But I believe that Romney made an immense gaffe in the last couple of days that will reverberate for at least some time. And you can see it in the reactions not just of people like Mark Salter or Peggy Noonan, but when you have mainstream journalists who've had some significant sympathy towards Obama, like Mark Halperin, calling it a craven move, it tells you something. And I found it, the questions of whether it was a right or wrong thing to do aside, just focusing on the politics, an incredibly puzzling move to step in this way for a candidate who has to both certainly keep his base both secure and enthusiastic, but reach out to another group of voters, intervening on a day when there's a great national tragedy and not stepping aside, which is what would normally happen, just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and I'm still trying to figure out why he did it. I was in Utah and mostly around a group of people, many of whom are not only deeply sympathetic towards and know very well Mitt Romney, but others who are close advisors of his, and almost universally those who were not on that campaign plane or around the central headquarters were just appalled. Now, how much that resonates over a long period of time, I don't know, but it does suggest to me that you have a campaign that's still trying to find traction in a theme. And they've gone away from the theme that this is all about a referendum on the economy, just kind of reaching out to try and find something else to get some traction. And it's Medicare, then it's foreign policy, and maybe they will eventually find that theme, or maybe it won't matter in the end. And I would also say the events of the last couple of days remind us that there are probably going to be more such events in the Middle East and or elsewhere, not only with our response in Libya, and I think the thesis that this had nothing to do with a film in Libya and everything to do with an al-Qaeda group getting revenge against the drone assassination of the number 2 in al-Qaeda, who was Libyan, certainly makes a whole lot of sense. But some of those events could redound to the advantage of Obama, and some of them in the other direction. But at the same time, we see from one of our survey results here that, and from what we've seen in other polls, that what was a 10 to 15 point advantage for Republicans on how you deal with terrorism has been erased entirely by Obama. It's a strength, not a weakness of his, and that can change, but anyhow, it's just an example of how events can turn around our perceptions of things. A quick point on early voting, which Carlin mentioned. We are going to see a dramatic upsurge, and I think what we're going to see this time, too, is that Democrats who are very worried about voter suppression efforts in a number of key states are going to redouble their efforts to try and negate what has long been a Republican advantage in absentee and early voting in some of those states. Because, of course, what we know about voter fraud is we've had clear-cut examples of it in absentee voting. We have almost no examples of it in voting at the polls on Election Day. Most of the laws that have been passed deal with voting at the polls on Election Day. So it creates a big incentive, and of course, some of that voting will start within a matter of just a couple of weeks in some states, and then keep in mind that as we begin to look at events ahead, including debates, we may have a whole lot of people in states like Iowa who will have voted before they even see what happens in some of those debates. I want to make a point. Henry will talk about the Senate races, but about money. There is, of course, an enormous amount of money out there, including all the outside money. And I would say for some of the Democratic Senate candidates in particular, secretly, they probably would like to keep the presidential race close and unpredictable for as long as they can. Because the fact is, if the race did break significantly, where most of the political insiders believed that, say, Obama's going to win, and unless there's some miracle, Romney won't, Karl Rove is going to shift his $250 million into Senate and House races, marginal Senate and House races, much more than he would otherwise. And they'd just prefer to have that money out of the picture. At the same time, we know that basically, if you want to parse this out, this election is about two things. It's about turning out your base, and then it's about a really tiny sliver of voters who are going to be the ones who will make the decisions in those swing states. Very quickly, if you want to parse it out, I would say we've got a third of the country who identify as Democrats, a third as Republicans, and a third as independents. Of the third who identify as independents, a third lean to the Democrats and a third lean to the Republicans, and we know from a lot of data that they vote exactly the same as those who identify as Democrats and independents. That leaves about 10% of the electorate, half of whom pay attention to what's going on, and the other half are clueless and basically are independent because they could care less. And most of them won't vote, although some will. They tend to be classic referendum voters. Things are good, vote the ins. Things are bad, vote the ins out and the outs in. So you're left with a pretty small group of voters, 4 to 8%, who are perhaps swingable, but most of those are in states where it won't matter. If I swing an independent voter in Utah, what do I care? It's not going to make any difference. So we're really looking at about 2% of the electorate in those swing states. And that 2%, some of whom may be in this room, are going to be responsible for $1 billion or more in advertising that will make it inescapable, unless you have the best TiVo that the world has devised, to avoid feeling like a goose force-fed for the foie gras. ESPN has already blocked out most of its ads for political campaigns. The big winners in this economy are the local television stations because, of course, the outside groups are not bound by lowest unit rate. They will pay top dollar, and they're already roadblocking time in most of these places. And they will, by the way, squeeze out the candidates in a lot of cases as well. Now, just a few comments on issues. Congress is back. Who would know it? This truly is the mother of all do-nothing Congresses. The famous 80th Congress that Harry Truman ran against was, ironically, a quite productive Congress. We've discussed that here before. They did the Marshall Plan, for God's sake. Passed the Marshall Plan, you could go home and you'd be a historic Congress. But they also reorganized our foreign policy establishment, did a lot of other significant things. This Congress really hasn't. They have enacted into law the smallest number of bills in modern times. Now, you know, as I said, it's quality as much as quantity. Where's the quality? Well, it was the debt limit debacle, is their Marshall Plan. But of the 60 or so bills that they've enacted, about a third are naming post offices. So there isn't much going on, and they are back trying to make their mark, but they've decided they want to do next to nothing. They want to get out of here as fast as they can, which is a classic thing for a Congress and a presidential election. There is one issue, however, hanging fire that almost has to be dealt with, and I mention it because I think it could have a significant impact on the election, and that is the Farm Bill. It is actually bizarre in a way. We are in the midst of the greatest drought since the Great Depression. You've got a lot of other major issues involving a farm bill. You had a bill pass the Senate with 74 votes. It was one of the few examples, transportation being the other, where you found in this highly polarized environment a broad bipartisan consensus and support, and it's been sitting in the House for weeks or months. We've had farm demonstrations. Farm state people are very upset, and it's basically because a group of House conservatives will not let the farm bill go unless they can get major concessions on food stamps. In places like North Dakota, where you've got a pivotal Senate race, in Iowa, where you've got this significant presidential contest, the Farm Bill matters as much as any of these other issues. And it could have an impact, interestingly, in a host of ways. And then, of course, the failure and refusal to deal with the fiscal cliff before the election may have an impact both on the markets and also on perceptions of people about who's best able to handle the economy.
Thanks very much, Norm. Now, Henry, if you could keep yours very crisp and short, 5 to 7 minutes, and then.
Well, now, thanks to Norm, I know what it felt like to live in Rome right before the Vandals came. There's not a whole lot to say about the Senate races that aren't individually summed up in the very excellent sheet. Most observers see the races all coming out the same way, which is perhaps less than a 50% chance the Republicans are going to pick up the 4 seats they need for control, regardless of who wins the presidency, but pretty substantial 90% or above chance that they'll pick up at least 1 seat. I think what I want to talk about is the 3 themes underlying all of the Senate races. One, and that is no wave election for one party or another. 2, the ability of Democrats to disassociate themselves from the national brand, which is something that neither Republicans in 2008 nor Democrats in 2010 were successfully able to do. And 3, despite that, the tendency of Senate races to break all one way, even in non-wave years. So the first thing is that a lot of Republicans had thought that 2012 was going to be 2010 redux, that the voter anger that was experienced and expressed in 2010 was deep, it was sustained, and most importantly was in favor of them as opposed to the particular circumstances that were happening in 2010 and opposition to President Obama. I think it's pretty clear that that was not the case, that the strongly pro-Republican sentiment that was manifest in the polls throughout most of 2010 pretty much started to dissipate by the beginning of 2011, was pretty much gone, and we were back to 50-50 nation. By the middle of 2011, the state elections in Virginia that year pretty much ran out as if it were a typical non-wave year. And that's what the generic ballots show, is that we're back to neither a Democratic wave nor a Republican wave. And I think what 2010 did, and in retrospect, was re-energize a active, principled Republican Party, which summoned up the 50-50 break that Michael's been talking about for well over a decade now. And so we're back to where we were in 1996, which is a nation divided against itself that can't quite make up its mind which of the 2 competing directions it wants to go in. Democrats, despite that, I think you could have plausibly made a case that even in a 50-50 nation, it would be hard to associate yourself from the very strong Democratic brand that the president had set out in 2009 and 2010. That hasn't happened. That moderate Democrats like Joe Donnelly in Indiana the Crossroads GPS and Americans for Prosperity and National Republican Senatorial Committee are trying to tie them to President Obama and say that they're essentially not any different. Those attacks are persuading the base, but they're not persuading the middle. There's no indication that a credible, non-ostentatiously liberal Democratic candidate is being held down, weighed down by his party or her party identification in the way that virtually everybody was in 2010. That means that there are races like North Dakota and Indiana, which most observers thinking of a 2010 election would have had written off for the Democrats, that are very much in play and are very much dependent both on the campaigns to come and on the general trends in a 50-50 nation. Those people are here to stay. And that places fear in the hearts of Republican strategists. The third thing is that going back at least to 2000, and I haven't gone back beyond that, even in non-wave years, Senate races tend to break in one direction. That the old model of the 80s or the early 90s, where Senate races tended to be independent variables, where you really could pick out one, this guy's doing well and that guy's doing badly, hasn't really held true in the last 12 years, that in close races going into Election Day, one party will sweep virtually all of them. It's impossible right now to know which direction that's going to sweep in. If it's a close race, will Republican voters or independent voters in Republican-leaning states vote the straight ticket, whether literally, as in the case of Indiana, where you have a straight Republican ticket that you can punch, or figuratively in the case of North Dakota, where you just go in and mark all the Republicans? Or would it be the other way, that the swing voter who doesn't like Mitt Romney and decided to stick with President Obama makes the decision to give President Obama's candidates the benefit of the doubt all the way down the road? That's the sort of thing that might save Elizabeth Warren, who otherwise seems to be headed to a very frustratingly narrow defeat to a very strong candidate in Scott Brown. We don't know, but I think that's something that we need to take a look at. It's an established pattern now going back well over a decade, and it could very well be that we'll have no national wave, but we will have a Senate break one way or the other that'll determine control.
Thank you very much, Henry. You mentioned straight ticket voting. You alluded to it in Indiana. And about how many states are you in? How many states are you able to just punch R these days?
How many states are you able to punch R? I think it's about 16. I know it's not a majority of the states, but in the only one that you can do a straight ticket voting that the Senate is really in play in is Indiana. All the other states are either not having Senate elections right now, or there's the candidacy is not really in play.
In terms of recruiting?
Patty Murray's had a great year in recruiting. I don't think the Republicans have had a terrible year, but both because of circumstance, which is, the Republicans took a strong candidate out of the House in Joe Donnelly, and that left him no option but to run for Senate. But you take a look, and there's plenty of seats where Republicans worry about their candidate's ability to pull it all together. But there's really no seat that has dropped off the radar screen for the Democrats because of a weak candidate. And again, whether that's because of Murray or because of circumstance, the Democrats have had a very good candidate recruitment year.
Looking at a few specific races, let's look at Wisconsin, where Thompson seems to be leading Baldwin. Could that help Romney Ryan?
I've never seen that a candidate at the senatorial level helps a candidate at the presidential level. Thompson himself might be a little sui generis because he's the atypical Senate candidate, having had nearly 30 years of experience in Wisconsin politics and having the reason he's ahead is because a little bit of a weakness of Baldwin, but mainly because he just really strikes a chord with the average Wisconsin voter. With Ryan Romney in Wisconsin, I'd be more likely to think that a unusual effect would come from Ryan spending $2 million of his own money on advertising in Milwaukee and Madison to save himself, well, not save himself, but to help himself get reelected in the House.
It's not his personal money, it's his House campaign money.
Right, it's his House campaign money, but the point is that, Obama is going to be relying on outside PAC money and his own money for his own advertising. Romney is going to be doing his, outside, the outside money, the super PAC, and his own money. But then you've got this $2 to $3 million chunk that Ryan can legitimately spend on his own behalf. And because of where his district is, he has to advertise in 2 of the 3 largest media markets of the state. He has to advertise in Madison, and he has to advertise in Milwaukee. And the fact is, Ryan's expenditures on television in those 2 markets alone will equal President Obama's or exceed it for the remaining 8 weeks of the campaign. Is that going to be enough because of the media markets? It won't just touch his 1 congressional district, which is, 1/8 of Wisconsin, but it'll touch virtually 60% of the Wisconsin electorate. Will that be enough to matter? I think that'll be much likelier than Tommy Thompson being on the ballot to be an independent, non-presidential variable that affects the outcome.
I must say, Carlin, just I'm really curious to see what that advertising is, because if it is re-elect Paul Ryan to the House of Representatives, that's going to confuse the hell out of a whole lot of people. He wants to protect himself, but obviously the more you focus on getting re-elected to the House, the more you're saying, hey, we are probably not going to win this presidential contest. So does he use that money as generic Paul Ryan advertising, not mentioning an office? It's a little tricky here.
I think the easy answer is you do issues.
Yeah, well,
that's...
you do generic Paul Ryan advertising, and you don't have the voiceover narrative say House. You just have it on the screen, and you talk about Ryan leadership for America, Ryan this, Ryan that, and
I think
never say House in the voiceover.
People will be familiar enough with the fact that he's running for re-election as Congress, and it's not all that often that Wisconsin has someone on a national ticket. Pay attention to that.
I could ask a lot more questions about Senate races, but I want to turn to your questions now. We have only 10 minutes, and so I want to put a couple of questions on the table. First, that question, and let's get this one, and then this one, and then we'll try to answer them. Only 2 questions? We've covered a lot of ground.
Brian Beery, Washington correspondent for Europolitics. Question about the presidential race and one specific demographic, which would be lower income white voters. I know they're a key demographic, and specifically on something like tax policy, where there is a bit of a clear difference on between Romney, Ryan, and Obama, and the tax cuts. How do you think it's going to break in terms of the lower income white voters and where they're going to go in the presidential race?
Nat Masworth with the Christian Post. My question is for Norm Orstein. Political scientists tell us that the debates don't really make much difference, but during the primary they seem to make a lot of difference going from state to state. And also, if you look at the economic indicators and right track, wrong track, and presidential approval, if and the race is so close, if Obama were to win or barely lose, would political scientists have to rewrite the elections chapter for the Intro to American Government?
Third question on the table, and then we'll take them.
Well, we still have 3 presidential debates coming up, 1 vice presidential debate. How late can a late break come? Is it too late for Romney, or could a late break come after October 15?
Who'd like to start?
Well, working class whites, whatever you want to say, the category that we used from the exit poll that's most helpful in this regard is non-college graduate whites. Obama in 2008 carried only 15 states, carried non-college whites in only 15 states with 124 electoral votes. He did not do well. However, he carried non-college whites in 4 of the 12 target states that we talked about: Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and New Hampshire. Not by any wide margin in any of those states, but he did, and I think in at least the first 3 of those, that's evidence of a vestige of what once were very strong blue-collar unions, and to some communities still are, and the Democratic Party loyalties those unions engendered. And so, if he is weaker with that group, as was suggested by the 2010 House elections, where the Democrats' support went down from 40% that Obama got in 2008 from that group down to, I think it was 33% that they got in the House elections of 2010. That does pose a problem for Obama, particularly that 3 of those 4 states are states with very low black populations: Wisconsin, Iowa, and New Hampshire. So as far as James Lucier's question, how late can it go? I don't know. Ask Ronald Reagan. Ask Pat Cadell or the late Dick Wirthlin, who were looking at that polling data change over the last weekend of the 1980 race. Now, obviously, you had the single debate in the last week of the campaign. It's a different circumstance, but it does tell us that that's possible.
Yeah. Just a quick point on the white working class voters in the new Fox poll this morning. Romney beat Obama among them by 22 percentage points. Obama lost the group by 18 points in 2008. He can't afford to lose that group by much more. But again, it's a close call at this point.
Well, let me talk a little bit about the debates, and it's interesting. Look at page 2 of the handout, which is a very interesting chart that looks at the positions of the election winner before the first debate and after the last debate. And it's a little surprising when you look at some of these. Now, political scientists, you're absolutely right, discount the importance of debates because they look at larger underlying forces. I think that's a bit of a mistake. It can make a difference. It can make a difference at the margins, but that can often be in a close election where it matters. In this case, I would argue, Neil Newhouse has been trying strenuously to suggest that the template for this race is 1980. Most of the political scientists who look at this stuff kind of dismiss that. This doesn't look like a 1980. It looks like a 2004 in a lot of ways. But you could make a case that it did matter in 1980. Partly it matters in whether it's a referendum on the incumbent. 1980 really was a referendum on the incumbent. There were serious questions about the challenger. Once the challenger got over the bar, it moved back to being a referendum on the incumbent. In this case, I think it's much more, at this point, a choice. And Romney certainly has to get over the bar, and it becomes even more important if you have days like yesterday for him. And there the first debate may matter. People are going to pay some significant attention, and they'll get into it. But I'm not sure it changes the underlying dynamics of anything. And at the same time, I think I would argue that with an election where we have a very substantial share of the electorate that's pretty much fixed in there, part of the question is whether there's any enthusiasm gap on those sides. But with a relatively small number who are persuadable or changeable, sure, you could find something in the last couple of weeks that could break one way or the other that could make the difference.
Can I just note here, it's a footnote to what Norm said, the chart on page 2. If you add up the net gain or loss of the winning candidates, it turns out that the one that does best, and on 2 occasions, is that man well known in history as a brilliant debater, George W. Bush.
On the white working class, 2 things. One, that 22 points is about the minimum that Romney needs to eke out, like the narrowest of victories under the most favorable demographic circumstances. He really needs to win them by about 25 or 26 points to have a realistic shot at victory. And the white working class is not a uniform vote. The largest single group of white working class voters in America are Southern evangelicals, who are clearly motivated by other issues besides their economic status. And the areas that Michael just pointed out where Obama did well are areas where the white working class is dominated by Catholic voters or by non-evangelical Protestant voters. In the case of Wisconsin, Romney continues to have a very difficult time connecting with those voters. And in that sense, where we're talking about the tax policy, Romney, research from other countries has shown that white working class voters have a very difficult time understanding complex tax policies. What they have an easier time understanding is a very simple, clear message. So in Canada, for example, their research, which is what I'm relying on there, led Stephen Harper to say, I'm going to cut the VAT instead of talk about complex tax reform. Why? It was a tax cut everyone got and everyone understood. So what do we have? We have Romney, who's offering a complex tax policy that literally you would have to go to a tax calculator to figure out whether you come out ahead or behind, and you don't even know half of the assumptions that will let you do that. Or you've got President Obama's tax policy. I want to tax the rich, and I don't want to tax you. Just from a message standpoint, that's something that is resonatable. That's something that's understandable by the white working class, who are capable of being persuaded. And they tend to be in the North. They tend to have different backgrounds, and they tend to have that union, not anti-business legacy that remains a real legacy. So from that narrow perspective, the tax policy probably cuts slightly in Obama's standpoint.
I think we have one question in the back, and if I could remind you, the next Election Watch is October 25th. We'll assemble in this room again at the same time, and then we will have a post-election luncheon on November 8th, 2 days after the election, to tell you all what we have learned from the election results. Question?
Thanks, Wei Ming Tan, Singapore Embassy. There are two areas of that the DNC focused a lot on. One was the auto bailout, which Mr. Barone talked about, mentioned briefly, and the other one was military veterans. Especially with military veterans, it surprised me in the sense that Republicans tend to poll better with military veterans. But could I get your thoughts on why the Democrats decided to focus so much on that? And with the auto bailout, does that focus reflect the Obama campaign's belief that its path to victory is through the Rust Belt states as opposed to through Florida? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
Well, let's see. The first thing is military veterans tend to favor Republicans, and yet the Democrats are emphasizing it. Well, partly because the Democrats want to make gains, partly because when you look down the list of polling questions and issues, there aren't that many issues that help Obama and the Democrats. The overall economy, well, not so much. Obamacare, well, they talked a lot about it at the convention, but not when the TV cameras were on, the broadcast network TV cameras were on. And so the answer is that he does get generally positive ratings on foreign policy, and they're capitalizing on work that Michelle Obama has done, that the president has done to some extent, that the Bidens have done in addressing the issues and problems facing military personnel and their families. And that's something that they started off doing early in the administration, and I think it was a good move governmentally and a good move politically. Yeah. So I think that's why we're seeing that kind of emphasis. It's partly faute de mieux, as Jean-Francois Carey would say, and partly because it's a genuine strength. Yeah. And they hope to make some gains among a demographic that probably tends to start off favoring the other party.
Yeah. Quick note on the auto bailout. It now polls favorably in several polls. And Henry, I wonder if you could talk about it in Ohio in particular.
Ohio is an area that had a lot of layoffs because of the auto bailout, because of the automobile industry crash. The fact that the auto industries are coming back is something that has helped Ohio's economy outperform the national economy in terms of unemployment rate in the last year or so. And there's also the question of values, which is what the Obama campaign is trying. The Republican strategists on the right had wanted Mitt Romney to run a campaign of values. We believe in America is the slogan. And basically what Obama's doing is calling and raising, to use a poker term. He's saying the real values of America are the values of helping somebody when they're on their hard luck. And for those of you who've seen It's a Wonderful Life, the movie, basically what Obama's trying to do is Obama's trying to say, I'm George Bailey. I'm the guy that you want, when you're on your luck, you want me holding your mortgage. Because Mr. Potter is going to foreclose on you. It's just a business decision. And he's trying to turn Mitt Romney into Mr. Potter. And in places like Ohio, it's working.
Final comment.
Okay, just a couple of comments on the auto bailout and Ohio. Michael was right when he said at the beginning that there are multiple paths to 270 electoral votes for each of these candidates. But I think it's fair to say that there are a lot more paths for Obama than there are for Romney. And whether it's Ohio or Florida, if Obama wins one of those two states, the path for Romney becomes a very narrow, difficult to achieve, and tricky one. Romney was done no favors by a headline writer when he did his op-ed that said, "Let Detroit go bankrupt." And now he's saying it's more complicated than that. Get back to Henry's. You don't want to say it's more complicated than that. That's not a very good path to take. So whether this polls well around the country or not, it resonates in Ohio. It's why Michigan, I think, has seen the Romney campaign basically drop any spending. They think that's just a non-starter for them. And it's why I think you'll see an enormous sum of money go into Ohio, because they've got to find a way to counter it, but it gives Obama a much larger advantage and traction than he otherwise would have.
Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you on October 25th. Thank you. Everybody's sick on this panel. Yeah. How are you? Haven't seen you in a long time.
Yes, that was